Hello, and welcome to week number 28 of my week at the club, where I'm bringing you my weekly chess games from the Wachusett Chess Club in Fitchburg, Mass. I'm Roger Capallo, a USCF expert with a rating of in the 1900s now. This week I played Brett Kildahl, who's a strong expert at the club, in the final round of the Reggie Boone Memorial. But before I get into that, I wanted to say a few words about well, first of all, the extra pictures here. This is Brett and me playing at the club on Wednesday night. In the middle there is the astronomy shot for the week. And this is a fairly recent Hubble photo of a planetary nebula called the Rotten Egg Nebula, or also the Calabash Nebula, and it has a descriptor number that's somewhat less interesting than either of those. And planetary nebulae are things that are not related to planets at all. The reason they have that name is because if you look through a telescope, they're roughly the size of a planet. They're planet-like. They look like circular objects in the sky that are fairly small, and they're not star-like. They're bigger than stars. And what they are stars that are red giant stars that are near to the ends of their lives in their stellar evolution. And so they've gone through most of the hydrogen in their core, and they're burning heavier elements. And there's some instability set in where they start throwing off gas and dust into interstellar space, which is a good thing because that's what we're all made of, are the reprocessed remains of stars. And it's important that this goes on because that's what replenishes these, or supplies those elements in the first place, and for rocky planets and hydrocarbon-based creatures like us to evolve. This picture is quite pretty. It's typical, though, of a Hubble Space Telescope photograph in that it's not the way that it would appear to your natural eye. So they show lots of beautiful photographs, but typically what they are photographs that are taken through multiple filters and then are portrayed using false colors. In this case, there are 4 filters pretty much near the red end of the spectrum, and they pick the colors in order to highlight the different elements that are emitting. The planetary nebula is quite hot when you get down low in the atmosphere of the red giant star, the supergiant star, and there's a lot of ultraviolet coming out and ionizing the interstellar medium. And you can see these gas jets that are going out at a appreciable fraction, like 0.1% or something, at the speed of light, plowing into the interstellar medium. And astronomers call this sort of arrangement a bipolar outflow, where you have material going in 2 opposite directions. And it's quite common on this scale and also on bigger scales in the centers of galaxies. Let's see, a final note is it's called the Rotten Egg Nebula, not because of the way it looks, but because it has a fairly high sulfur content. And if you could smell it, which of course you can't, it's very tenuous gas and it's a long way away, the sulfur would smell like rotten eggs. Okay, on to my game with Brett, because it was an interesting game. And so Brett opened with a D-pawn opening this week. And I responded symmetrically. He played c4, and then I tried a Slav defense, which is something I'm not sure I've ever played it in a rated game. I've played a couple of blitz games in a Slav defense, and so I was sort of making up some of this as we went along. But it turned out okay. So he played knight f3. I responded with knight f6. Those are standard developing moves in a Slav. And then I quickly got out of my book on the 4th move with his queen c2, which is not that rare of a move. It's not the most common of moves. Knight to c3 is more common, or e3. But queen c2, makes a lot of sense. It's positioning itself where it can recapture this pawn on c4 if I were to take it. And furthermore, what it's doing is it's keeping me from getting onto this diagonal. So normally, in a Slav, white would like to develop the light squared bishop outside of the pawn triangle and get the bishop out here on 5 before he pushes his e-pawn up. This move of queen to c2 prevents that. And so I thought for a while, and I had kind of had my heart set on getting my bishop more actively posted. I didn't want to play a semi-Slav, which is what you get if you play e6 and lock your bishop in. So I came up with this idea of capturing the c-pawn, figuring that he would take back with the queen, and then I'd be able to develop my bishop to that light squared diagonal. But he surprised me. He didn't recapture with the queen. Instead, he played pawn to e3. And of course, that attacks his pawn twice now. But if I defend it with a pawn, which is what I chose to do, then it's going to be a little harder for him to get it back. Now, at this point in the game, I had no intentions of trying to hold on to the extra pawn. But my hope was that in trying to recover that pawn, that Brett would be, make some less than optimal moves because he would have to do some things that fit in with his plan of recovering the pawn. So it sort of constrains his play. And that's sort of how the play went for the next several moves. So he didn't do anything to recover the pawn immediately. He just went ahead with rapid development with bishop to e2. And I continued on with e6 so that my king would not be stuck in the center. I want to get my king out of the center before he really is able to get totally developed and could break open the center, for example. And so I opened up my bishop so it could come out here along the dark square diagonal. The Stockfish says at this point that the game is 0.0, that we have equality. And it's really dynamic equality in this case because at the instant, Black is actually a pawn ahead, but White has a lead in development and also is a little stronger in the center with his center pawn on d4. And Stockfish, in this case, might be seen far enough ahead to realize that White will probably be regaining that pawn. So Brett went ahead and castled. I continued development with bishop to e7. Then he launched into the maneuvers to regain the pawn with a4. And now, as always happens in these sorts of positions, you have to start worrying about activity along the a file. So this a pawn, for example, is not necessarily a good defender because after pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, there would be a rook takes rook. And because of that, I immediately played my bishop to b7, defending my rook, and also putting the bishop on a not too bad square where eventually after this c-pawn moves, then I would be able to have a pretty good scope with the bishop looking at White's kingside. At least that was the plan. If he were to take my pawn right now, I can take back with my c-pawn. So what happened was that he continued to attack my pawns, but now instead of attacking at the base, attacking at the head of my pawn chain with b3. And I don't really want to allow an exchange on c4. He could take, I take back, and then he takes again. And I end up, not only does White win his pawn back, but I end up with his isolated c-pawn out of that action. So instead, I went ahead and traded the pawn off. I initiated the pawn trade, and then he needs to take back with the queen. As a result, I get this backward pawn on c6, but at this point, I'm hoping to be able to repair that. And so my next move was a6, which I've seen as a common maneuver in these Slav games, Slavs and semi-Slavs, where Black gets a pawn structure like so, and then at some point is able to play his c-pawn to c5. In this particular case, though, my c-pawn is already attacked 3 times, and if I were to move my c-pawn, I only have it defended once. So it's going to take quite a bit of preparation to move my c-pawn without losing a pawn. Although I might be willing to do it just to sack that pawn, just to get my development along. So Brett played his knight to d2. And the problem with the more active knight to c3, which puts more pressure on my queen side, is that black could just go ahead and push the d pawn, or the b pawn rather, and the knight would have to. Actually, it wouldn't have to step back immediately because the this pawn is pinned. But once I defended the bishop, the knight would end up having to move. And that's a moderate advantage according to Stockfish for black. So Brett rightfully didn't do that. He instead developed the bishop through d2, and I castled. And so now I can do something a bit more active. He played bishop to a3, which was an interesting move because it starts to, it gives him some activity along those dark squares, and also is threatening to tie my queen down in the defense of this bishop. And at some point I should have probably considered just trading off those bishops rather than allowing my queen to get tied down defending it. Instead, I developed my knight to d7, where it can either support a pawn push to c5, or at some point it might also come over here to b6. So either one of those squares, and it's important that it's covering both of those squares. Brett played rook f to c1, and that makes sense. I have that backward pawn. He wants to keep control of this c5 square, and I fully expected him to maneuver a minor piece and plunk it down on that square. Didn't happen, but that's sort of, at that point in the game, that's what I was thinking was a likely battle, is that he'd be trying to do that and I'd be trying to prevent that. So I played rook c8 in order to think about playing an immediate c5, even if it costs me my b pawn. And like I said, I'm willing to give that pawn back if it results in an even game for black. I don't want to hang on to it at the expense of that piece activity. But Brett took advantage of my temporary lack of defense on b7 to reroute his knight here to through c4. And the problem with that is that he's threatening now to come into d6, which I really didn't want to allow. If he did that, I would probably be forced to trade my bishop for that knight, and then he would have the bishop right in the heart of my position. It didn't look like a good thing to allow at that point. And Stockfish's choice was just to go ahead and trade the bishops off right now. But I didn't like that idea because I was afraid of his activity along the A file. So after bishop takes a3, rook takes back, queen takes, I thought he would double the rooks and maybe get some activity along the A file. But at this point, actually, Stockfish suggests playing the rook back to A1. So, you know, that's not what I was worried about as being the best move, but it's why I didn't go into this line, was that doubling of the rooks. So instead, I went ahead and played this pawn sack, also seeing that I might actually get some activity against the white queen out of this. And that's exactly what happened. So he traded off pawns and then took on b5 with his queen. And now, originally, when I very first looked at this, I was thinking about following up with the bishop to c6, like so, gaining some time on the queen. But I actually realized after I looked at it that a stronger move is probably not the immediate attack, but instead to play my rook in this position, to play my rook to b8, threatening a discovered attack on the queen. So, you know, if white did nothing about it right now, I could play bishop takes knight, and when he recaptures, the queen would get one, or actually more to the point, if I played bishop takes knight, he would move his queen, and then I would actually win another piece in this particular example. But you know, anyhow, there are various threats involved with this. He has to do something about this immediate threat. And what he chose to do was more or less what I expected, which was to get the queen off of the file. So I continued to hassle his queen then with rook to a8, and that forced, given that he's a couple hundred points higher than I was, I had the luxury of repeating moves. If he had gone back to b5 at this point in the game, I probably would have been happy with the repeating moves and drawing the game. Fortunately, he didn't do that for me, and he played his rook to c2. And that allows me to even have more activity with bishop to e4 attacking the queen yet again. And his best move at this point, according to the computer, and I agree, it's what I was expecting during the game, was for him to go ahead and play the queen to d1. In fact, it might have been best to go there in the first place. Okay, where are we? Which move? Okay, bishop to d4. So queen to d1, and the computer claims equality at this point. Instead, what he did was to interpose the bishop. And this allows me to initiate a sequence of a large number of trades, which end up giving me a much better late middle game, early end game sort of position. So what I do is I take the knight that is poorly defended now, has to be taken back with the g-pawn, sort of ruining the pawn structure over by his king. Then I'm able to play pawn takes pawn, which then discovers an attack on the bishop on a3, and he takes back. I mean, if he wanted to, he could trade the bishops off here, but that would be no advantage to him because I just take back with the queen, and then my rook would be defended by the other rook. So he takes back with pawn. Now he has an isolated d pawn as well, bishop, and then I initiate the trade of bishops. And he could take back either with the knight or the rook, but either way his knight's going to end up on a3. Since he took back with the rook, I went ahead and traded a pair of rooks, and now his knight goes to a3, captures on a3, and he's in a position where he has a significantly weakened pawn structure. I mean, he has 3 pawn islands. I only have 1 pawn island here. The pawns that look quite good, all connected, where he has 3 different pawn structures that can't defend one another. And I have beautiful squares to work on with my knights, like d5 is very nice. Now let's make that a red square, and f4. And even at some point maybe with the knight coming into h3. So my eyes lit up when I saw this endgame, and I was really happy to get into this position. I realize now as I opened up the attack on that bishop, there was one point that I wanted to make a little earlier. So if you'll forgive me, I'll skip back a few moves and go back to this position where let's say I played the knight to d7, and the point is that right now, after I play knight to d7, all of a sudden he has a lot of activity going on. So the bishop is threatening to take my bishop here, deflecting my queen at some point, which could be a tactical problem. If my pawn were to move, like with pawn takes pawn, his queen could win my bishop on b7 because it's undefended, so that's gluing my pawn on the b file. And his rook, in some variations, is threatening to take on a8. So there were a lot of geometric ideas, very rich geometric ideas in this position, and I had to tiptoe a little carefully. So it turned out that I was able to do so, and as you saw, we got into a position where, after I'd played c5, where we had a massive series of exchanges. In fact, 8 moves in a row had a piece exchange. And I got to this nice endgame with all these weak squares. And I looked at this position, and what I really wanted to do at this point was play my queen over to this g5 square with check. And move our knight up and to attack his weakened king position with the queen and knight and this weak pawn on f3. But I had a hard time figuring out how to do it, because if I move, all these arrows and things are getting to be a nuisance. But if I move this knight on f6 to get it out of the way, and like to a sensible square such as d5 here, his queen and bishop are bearing down on h7 and can take with check, and then he can retreat the bishop. And I couldn't see a line that really looked good for me there, or any reason to give up that pawn. And so I looked at other ideas, such as maybe queen out to a5. But if I played queen to a5, attacking this knight that was undefended, then I was afraid he'd just play knight to b5. And now that knight is defended on b5, and furthermore, he shut off the idea of me going over to g5 with check. So this was a geometrical theme where I was going to come out and attack his knight and then come over to g5. But by simply moving his knight to the safe square b5, he defeats that. And now my queen gets stuck over on the queen side. So I didn't want to have that happen. So instead, what I did in this position, after a fair amount of thought, is I saw the move queen a8. And it's kind of sweet, because it's attacking this undefended pawn, or undefended knight rather, on a3. It's also attacking the pawn on f3. And I saw his reply, or I saw a reply like his. What he did do was to play queen to b3. What I expected, let's go forward here. What I expected in this position, I'm having a little trouble with the scroll. I expected that he might actually play queen to c3, at which point I could attack it with my knight, and the queen would have to move while still defending this knight, such as queen here to a3, and then my knight would come over here and attack this bishop, and all of a sudden this is starting to look like quite a good position. I should point out that for either of these moves, queen to c3 or queen to b3, like he actually played, there's a little trap here, which I had seen ahead of time and wasn't really in danger of falling into. But it's that I get overambitious and actually take this pawn on f3. So if you don't see it immediately, you could stop your video, pause it for a few seconds, and see if you see why black can't get away with taking the pawn on c3. Okay, well, it's actually written here in the notes, but actually it isn't. I had it carefully hidden. Okay, if I were to take the pawn on not on c3, on f3, sorry. If I were to take the pawn on f3, big blunder, you can just play bishop takes f7 check, h7 check, and either my king takes it, or my knight takes it, or my king moves, doesn't matter what. I have to do something about it, and then he wins my queen. So, bad idea. Okay, so I couldn't do that, and what I chose to do back in this position after Brett played queen to b3 was instead to play queen to d5. And this is probably an okay move, but I think if I had it to do over again, I wouldn't have made this move. The way I analyzed it during the game was I'm more or less forcing an exchange of queens into the endgame, because if he moves a queen away somewhere, I can come over and check on g5, and my knight and queen can attack on the king side work together quite efficiently. The thing that's bad about this, allowing the queen trade, is, well, let me back up. I felt that the queens didn't need to be on, that there were enough weaknesses in White's position that with my two knights that were actually, well positioned, that I could maneuver to those good squares, and that the pawn here on d4 especially would be easy to win. So I felt that it should be a fairly easy end game to win after the queen trade. And it turned out that wasn't the case. So he went ahead and traded off the queens. And after he traded off the queens, played knight to b5. So, getting a more active post for the knight, not leaving it on the side of the board. And it's also defended there. It's a good square. And it also defends this pawn on d4 that I want to go after with my rook. So first I decided to activate my pieces. I played knight to f6. He put his bishop on a more active square where it's defending the f pawn. Of course, at this point, I don't really want to trade my knight for the bishop because that would repair his pawns, and then he would only have that one weakness of the isolated h-pawn, which I figured at that point was probably not enough to win. So I wouldn't want to take that bishop. But what I do need to do is to make Luft for my king, because there could be potential mating problems here if I get a little too aggressive with my rook going after the pawn. So I went ahead and made Luft by taking away some of the light squares from his bishop. And he brought his king toward the center of the board, which makes sense. I played my knight to f4. The idea of that is that it then controls those two squares on e2 and g2, and that keeps his king in a mating net. I thought there might be some possibility where my rook would come over and threaten mate on the back rank, or at least he would have to worry about that. So let's see, let's slide the window up a little bit here. Instead, he played rook to a1, and that allowed me to go ahead and attack his knight, which is no longer defended by the bishop. And since I'm not worried about checkmate on the back rank, I figured this was a real threat, that he'd have to do something about moving the knight. And I sort of discounted his response. I saw it, but I didn't think he would do it. And that's it. He played rook to a8, forcing the trade of rooks. And the reason I wasn't worried about that was because after rook takes rook, bishop takes, I still have all those weaknesses of the pawns, and my knights are still good, and I figured that this really should be an easy endgame to win. So I was wrong, but that was my thinking anyhow. I centralized my other knight, also cutting off his bishop a bit. And at this point, I would be happy if he traded his knight for my his bishop for my knight, rather. I would recapture with my knight, and we'd have a pure knight endgame, but he would have these weaknesses that my king could get in and attack, king or knight. And at this point, Brett played king to e1 and offered a draw, which I think was a fairly strategical draw. We were roughly equal in time. I think I was a little better than he was. We had about 20 minutes each. And he, black's a little better, but, it's still possible to screw up and lose his position. I'm the lower rated player and by a couple hundred points, so I suspect he figured I would be attracted by the draw, which I was, but I wasn't very attracted. I thought about it for a minute or so and went ahead and made my move, because I was really convinced that black was winning at this point. If you look at Stockfish, let's see, I forget, see what it says. Yeah, the edge is only about 3/4 of a pawn in black's favor. So that's not very big, and it turns out not only is it only 3/4 of a pawn, it turns out Stockfish doesn't have any idea how to go about winning this position. So I centralized my king, and he brought his in closer to the center, and I brought mine closer. And now he came to c6 with the idea that if my king gets too far away from my pawns, that he'll be able to come in behind the pawns and attack them. They're on light squares. So at this point, I started to push my pawns onto more favorable squares, move my h-pawn, and in particular, I wanted to not only gain space, but to get my h-pawn advanced so that if I could ever win his h-pawn, even with the sacrifice if necessary, then my H pawn gets to be a threat to queen. So he rerouted his knight back through the side of the board. I played my pawn to a dark square, so that it couldn't be attacked by his bishop. And he brought his knight in, threatening now to come into e5, which either would be a strong post or I could drive it away with a pawn when he does that. But I really didn't want to let his knight in attacking the pawns on my king side. So, and besides which, I wanted to be on the dark squares at this point, so I played pawn to f6. He shuffled his king. I moved my knight to start to try to see if I could stir something up here. And he played bishop to e4, and it turns out this is a mistake. Looking at it with Stockfish, I mean, I didn't see it, obviously, even in my post-game analysis without the computer. But this is actually not a good idea for him. And of course, what the threat was that I was going to play knight to c2 check, winning this e-pawn. And the e-pawn's, regardless, is a little hard to defend because it's stuck on a light-colored square, or a dark-colored square, sorry. And so what I did was just to move my pawn so that it would be defended and my knight would have the possibility of coming in here check. But there was a stronger possibility here, and that was for me to play f5. So f5, and that actually would make about a pawn. It ends up winning the d pawn, so it makes the evaluation go from minus 0.75 to minus 1.75, and probably would have given me enough of an edge to figure out how to win this game. But you know, what would have happened is if he retreated the bishop along the diagonal. I mean, if he went off the diagonal, I could have checked and won the d pawn immediately. So right, so if the bishop were to come, let me go back a second here. Bishop were to do something like that, say, then this check would win the d pawn immediately. If he stayed on the diagonal, like going to b1, then I can attack that e pawn, and there's no way to defend it. He could bring his king up, and after I win the pawn, he could fork my two knights, but they can defend each other. And eventually I can defend my f knight with either my king or with a pawn, and then move the other knight, and I've just ended up winning a pawn. So this actually is a significant advantage for black, but I didn't see that. Instead, I went ahead and after he played the bishop to e4, I put my pawns all in the dark squares. And then I just wasn't able to see much from here. He played the king out to d2. I brought my knight back. I mean, these are sort of shuffling moves. You know, you're not in that much of a hurry at endgame. If you have an advantage, you can afford to move your pieces around a little bit and try to find something a plan that's working for you. I came in with my knight to go after that weak f pawn, but he can go ahead and well, he can defend it eventually with his king, but actually he can afford to make this intermediate move here, this Fishinzu with knight to e3, because it'd be a bad mistake for me to take the knight. So just to show you what would happen if or to take the pawn, because if I took that pawn on f2, I saw this during the game, he could take my knight, trade off the knights with check, and then move his bishop to f5, and now my knight is trapped back on f2. It has nowhere to go. I can run into the corner, but that's about it. There's no safe square for it to get to, and he can just move his king in and harvest the knight at his leisure. So that's what did not interest me. I never checked this with the computer. I should analyze it and make sure I didn't make a goof. So apparently this is drawing because I could play Let's see. Huh. It's interesting. G4. And threatening to play the pawn to G3, defending this knight. And it looks like it's just losing the pawn. But, I mean, it is losing the pawn, but now we each have 3 pawns, basically. So it's still a draw. The knight isn't lost, but I succeeded in giving away the pawn that I was trying to win. So it's not a good idea. Probably no worse than what I did, though, as it turns out. So instead, after he played knight to E3, let's turn off the computer. I played my D knight into F4, thinking that I could, he would defend his pawn, and then maybe I would be able to check him away or something. But I mean, there's really no way to do that. And now I started getting a little worried after I brought my king out that maybe if I'm not careful, he could maybe find a way to trap my knights over here. I sort of doubt that's the case, but I decided to back after king to f1, I decided to back my knights back out. If he wanted to trade off knights here, I could recapture with the king, and that would be fine because I would still have the good knight, and I would end up winning this d pawn and likely the game. He didn't do that, though. He checked me, and now I really couldn't figure out any way to go forward with the game. I moved back. He repeated, and I just repeated, and we called it a draw. As I said before, the stockfish, even at this point, even though it thinks I have 6/10 of a pawn advantage because of the pawn structure, it can't come up with any plan for how to actually go about winning this. And I'm not sure that there is one. This is one of those situations where I'd like to have a player a lot stronger than I am, a grandmaster or something, take a look at it and see if they can find some sort of winning plan for black. But if you want to, and you can tell me what it is I missed, I'd be more than happy to hear your input. Put it in on the comments or just tell me at the club. So anyhow, it ended up in a draw. It wasn't a bad result. It wasn't as much as I was hoping for after about the 20th move or so, but it was okay. Ended the tournament, and next week we'll go on to a new tournament. So thanks for staying with me. If you've been with the video this long, as usual, I was going to try to make it faster, but we're getting close to 40 minutes. So I'll sign off now. See you next week.